Hey there, gang. Up next on the bench, we've got a Yamaha. This is a jumbo-sized acoustic. Made in Japan, I'm told. Big guitar. Here we can see the problem. It's a standard issue headstock crack, a neck fracture here at the back of the headstock. Now, I didn't talk to the customer on this one. This was subcontracted to me by my favorite local shop, and they did talk to the customer. And let's see if I can get you in there. This is actually the second time this neck has been broken in this location. Initially, we thought this little line here was just a lacquer check or something, but no, that's actually been repaired and done quite well. The glue held. And it illustrates something I've seen quite a lot in headstocks with multiple breaks, is oftentimes it's not recurring on exactly the same line unless there was a problem with the glue job, because the once repaired, the wood here is as strong or stronger than the unbroken wood. What happens is the force that causes the break gets shifted upwards slightly towards the headstock, and often the crack line is basically the same. It follows pretty closely or parallel to the previous break here, just everything gets shifted up a bit. The customer on this case wants us to do a spline job here, and that entails putting a couple of strips of wood, inlaying it into the back of the headstock, and solidifying or shoring up this area, making it a little stronger. Now, it's kind of debatable, like people do debate this stuff online, whether it's actually necessary to put splines in a headstock repair like this. I will say there are guitars out there that get broken a lot, like there are professional musicians who take their Les Paul out on tour and they just happen to be maniacs and they're constantly dropping them or throwing them or something, banging them into stuff. And I've seen a couple of examples that have been broken 6 or 7 times. In that case, the splines are really kind of helpful to your repair guy because they act almost like a key, and they keep things really nice and straight, and things go back together nicely when next time it gets broken. So yeah, Les Pauls are particularly susceptible, and guys can make their jokes in the comment section now. That's fine. You know, go on with the Gibson quality stuff. But this is a nice black guitar, so hiding it shouldn't be too difficult. We can do a little bit of a touch-up work there, make it shiny, and try to take care of this, make it disappear if we can. Sorry for the long delay between videos this month, guys. I had a death in the family, and right now I'm working on settling an estate, and it's taking a whole lot of time. I should hopefully get back on track pretty soon here. Here's a quick shot of the cork-backed caul I use for gluing up headstock breaks. I'm using Titebond glue, or Titebond style aliphatic glue. You could use hot high glue, you could use fish glue. The glue's been thinned very, very lightly with just a little bit of water. Not a lot, just a little bit more so it flows a little bit better. And I use a bristle brush here with relatively soft bristles, and they're long and they really get in there. And as you can see, I'm not shy with the glue. I get a lot in there. There's going to be a bunch of squeeze out, but it presses it down deep into the farthest recesses of the crack. And just to show that I'm familiar with the technique, because everyone always wants to tell me about this whenever I do this. I know how to do this. This is some compressed air. This is messy. I use an airbrush set for about 90 psi, and you can actually blow the glue deeper into a crack. The other reason why it's good to thin the glue out just a little bit. It flows better. To be honest, it's usually not necessary to do that. People want to tell me about it though, so let's demonstrate it. So we'll clean that off as much as we can. And then after cleaning it off, I always put some more in, just to make sure. I didn't degrease the area of the neck here where I'm doing this either, so any finger oils or atmospheric stuff that's on here is going to act like a bit of a wax resist, and it's going to come off relatively cleanly. But after we've put the splines in, we're also going to do some light sanding on the areas, so absolute cleanliness here is not necessary. Usually pretty easy to get this glue to come off afterwards. Okay. Number 1. Number 2. We're in the middle of a snowstorm here today. It was uncharacteristically early for the snow, even here in Canada. Shop's a little bit cool, which is another reason why I'm not using hot hide glue for this. I want enough time to get the clamps in place and get some squeeze out going on. Sometimes it's hard to do this while you guys are watching. These little orange Jorgensen clamps were a really good investment. They're just the right size for this sort of work and the right kind of strength. They're not too heavy either. Okay, so we'll get in there with a damp paper towel and clean this out. Cleaned up pretty nicely. It's pretty level. There's one little area here where both sides aren't in complete alignment. Sometimes what will happen is the water and the glue will get in there and expand them at different rates. So it's a good practice if you're going to sand something like this flush to wait several days before you do that. Let that water get absorbed or evaporate off and let the wood reach equilibrium again before sanding. Otherwise you could end up with something that's more distorted than when you start off with. But I think that's good enough. We're going to put the splines in now. Here's my spline cutting jig. It's pretty low tech. I've had it for ages. This one, I actually have two of these. This one is for a 5/16 router bit, which is about 8 millimeters. I've also got one that does 1/4 inch, which is around 6. And like I said, I had it for ages. This is a 1/4 inch piece of hardboard that goes in here. This acts as a height adjustment mechanism. I use it in conjunction with my Bosch Colt router. And the height adjustment on this is not good enough to allow for fine, super fine control. So what I like to do is set it for the full depth of cut, take a preliminary pass, and then I can just pop this out and do a second pass, and I'm not going to have to fool with the bit, so it remains concentric in exactly the same location in the base plate. And it just clamps onto the headstock. Given the nature of an angled headstock, it really only contacts at 2 points, one here up at the headstock and one at the very far edge here on the neck shaft. And I've got those heavily padded with cork. I also sometimes shim it up with other pieces of cork just to make sure that it's in the proper orientation to get the cut that I want. When laying out for the placement, we have to be mindful of the truss rod that's inside the neck. And in this case, there's this little witness line or ghosting here at the very end of the cavity where this piece of wood bent during the trauma. The truss rod in this case is a Martin style. It's got the aluminum extrusion in it that's kind of rectangular. It's almost 1/2 inch wide, so it's a big hole in there. We're going to angle inwards towards the center line of the headstock, which is going to do two things. It'll hopefully help us miss that cavity there, but it also will cross a little bit more grain. Rather than being in line with the grain, we'll actually move across it there and hopefully strengthen things a little bit. I've got some good clean mortises. For the splines, in terms of the material, if this was a clear-coated neck, obviously I'd be using mahogany to match the color in the grain. Because it's painted black, I have the option of going with a different wood. I'm using maple. It's very strong, and it's also got the advantage of having closed grain. There's no open pores on this, so I won't have to use a filler during the finishing process. That'll save me a step. These are very accurately fitted. That's important. If there's any wiggle room between the spline and the sidewalls of the mortise, you'd just be relying on the glue, and that has no real structural integrity. If it's flopping around in there, then you're just creating 4 lines of weakness in the back of the neck rather than strengthening it. So I planed it to exactly the right size, rounded the corners with a file and some sandpaper. So I'll glue that in with some tight bond, let it dry, and then we'll carve it down. Anytime I show myself carving, someone asks about the knives I use. Most of my carving is actually done with a very inexpensive German chip carving knife. These are available at any woodworking supplier. They only cost like $15. they're just fine. I also use this. This is a Sloyd knife. It's made by Mora in Sweden. I've gone ahead and extended the handle so it fits my massive paw a little bit better. I also have a really nice one made by Del Stubbs at Pinewood Forge, which is also a Sloyd pattern, except it's small. It's only about 1.5 inches long. It's good for detail work. The curve on the edge is helpful if I'm carving a heel on a classical guitar, or the intersection between the headstock and the neck shaft. Just good. It fits the hand nicely and it works well. People ask me about sharpening. That's difficult to teach. I mean, there are lots of good resources here on YouTube. There are also good books on the subject. Leonard Lee's Sharpening Woodworking Tools is good. But more than anything, it's just practice, really. Learning how to feel the edge. Beginners tend to go much too hard when they sharpen, a lot of pressure. But lighten up and you'll get a better edge. I've been using the same, this is a Japanese water stone, the same stone for 24 years now. It's getting kind of thin. It's a combination 1000, 4000 grit. And the other thing I'll say about sharpening is that professional woodworkers in any capacity sharpen as little as they can possibly get away with. You know, there are people who sort of fetishize the subject and take every single blade to super razor sharpness, and they get out their scanning electron microscope to make sure the edge is optimum all the way across. Nah, not for me. I just, I sharpen until it's good enough, and then I get back to work. The other thing is to sharpen frequently enough that you don't have to take off a whole lot of material. Nice thing about these Swedish Sloyd knives is they've got very wide, flat bevel grinds on them. They're not convex or concave. And when you're using them, you can actually use that as a steering device. You can run that nice flat surface up against, say, the curve here that I'm trying to match, and it'll follow along. It acts like a fulcrum, provides better control.
See freedom again. You know, we tell these stories every week, some solved, some unsolved, but we rarely get to. And he starts to kind of wonder, like starts to question. And now, I want to be very clear here that we're just telling the story of what happened as it was recorded. We're not accusing anyone of making false claims or even pretending to know what really happened on that night.
Got to carefully scuff sand the entire surface I'll be coating. I'll be using lacquer for this, and because this finish is probably a polyurethane, the lacquer won't be able to burn into it. It'll rely on a mechanical adhesion rather than melting the previous finish. The other thing I've done is I've gone along the just around the areas of the ends of the spline here. There's a little spot here where we lost some lacquer with a little bit of medium viscosity super glue to sort of fill the outlines in a little bit and just seal the wood surface slightly. I'm just using some 320 grit sandpaper here as a final sanding just to make sure that we're pretty good and level. I started off airbrushing some black tinted lacquer, and then I suddenly realized I think I've got something better for this, so I sanded it off again, grabbed this. This is a model maker's paint that's designed specifically for use on plastics, and I think it sticks better than lacquer does to something like this urethane. It holds on very tenaciously, and yet the lacquer sticks well to it, so yeah, seems like a good choice. I peeled off the masking on the binding here, and there was some scraping to do to clean up the lines. For top coats on small jobs like this, lately I've been liking this Watco brand spray lacquer in the rattle can. Works pretty well. Seems to cure harder than some of the others that are available on the market, which is nice. And as for the reason why the can and not a spray gun or the airbrush, it's just pragmatic. You know, there's a lot of cleanup involved. If I have to do 6 coats of lacquer, that's 6 times I'm dragging out the solvents and washing everything out and exposing myself to these really nasty chemicals. This thing, I spray it, let it sit for an hour and a half and then spray another coat and not have to worry about the cleanup so much. And it polishes up nice, so works fine.
There's a lot of level sanding and or scuff sanding in between coats. I used about 6 coats of lacquer to get things relatively flat on this job. After that, we'll buff it up with some polishing compound. That's always a satisfying part of the process, making things shiny.
Well there, friends, I think we're just about ready to call this one done. Turned out okay. It's not immediately evident that there are a couple of splines in there. If you look really close and notice some traces, well, you know, it looks well taken care of, and I guess that's the important thing. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again soon.